Lusibari. The tide was running low when the trust launch brought Kanai and Nilima to Lusibari, and this seemed to augment the height of the tall embankment that ringed the island. From the water, nothing could be seen of what lay on the far side. But on climbing the earthworks, Kanai found himself looking down on Lusibari village, and suddenly it was as if his memory had rolled out a map so that the whole island lay spread out before his eyes. Lusibari was about 2 kilometers long from end to end, and was shaped somewhat like a conch shell. It was the most southerly of the inhabited islands of the tide country. In the 50 kilometers of mangrove that separated it from the open sea, there was no other settlement to be found. Although there were many other islands nearby, Lusibari was cut off from these by 4 encircling rivers. Of these rivers, 2 were of medium size, while the third was so modest as almost to melt into the mud at low tide. But the pointed end of the island, the narrowest spiral of the conch, jutted into a river that was one of the mightiest in the tide country, the Raimangal. Seen from Lusibari at high tide, the Raimangal did not look like a river at all. It looked more like a limb of the sea, a bay perhaps, or a very wide estuary. 5 other channels flowed into the river here, forming an immense mahona. At low tide, the mouths of the other rivers were clearly visible in the distance, gigantic portals piercing the ring of green galleries that encircled the mahona. But Kanai knew that once the tide turned, everything would disappear. The rising waters of the Mahona would swallow up the jungle as well as the rivers and their openings. If it were not for the tips of a few kaura trees, you would think you were gazing at a body of water that reached beyond the horizon. Depending on the level of the tide, he remembered, the view was either exhilarating or terrifying. At low tide, when the embankment, or bad, was riding high on the water, Lusibari looked like some gigantic earthen ark flown serenely above its surroundings. Only at high tide was it evident that the interior of the island lay well below the level of the water. At such times, the unsinkable ship of a few hours before took on the appearance of a flimsy saucer that could tip over at any moment and go circling down into the depths. From the narrow end of the island, a mud bank extended a long way into the water. This spit was like a terrestrial windsock, changing direction with the prevailing currents. But just as a windsock can generally be counted on to remain attached to its mast, the mud bank too was doggedly tenacious in keeping a hold upon the island. It formed a natural pier that was where ferries and boats usually unloaded their passengers. There were no docks or jetties on Lusibari, for the currents and the tides that flowed around it were too powerful to permit the construction of permanent structures. The island's main village, also known as Lusibari, was situated close to the base of the mud spit, in the lee of the embankment. A newcomer, looking down at Lusibari from the crest of the Bad, would see a village that seemed at first glance no different from thousands of others in Bengal, a tightly packed settlement of palm-thatched huts and bamboo-walled stalls and shacks. But a closer examination would reveal a different and far from commonplace design. At the center of the village was a maiden, an open space not quite geometrical enough to be termed a square. At one end of this ragged-edged maiden was a marketplace, a jumble of stalls that lay unused through most of the week, coming alive only on Saturday, which was the market day. At the other end of the maiden, dominating the village, stood a school. This was the building that was chiefly responsible for endowing the village with an element of visual surprise. Although not large, it loomed like a cathedral over the shacks, huts, and shanties that surrounded it. Outlined in brick over the keystone of the main entrance were the school's name and the date of its completion: Sir Daniel Hamilton High School, 1938. The facade consisted of a long shaded veranda equipped with fluted columns, neoclassical pediments, vaguely Saracenic arches, and other such elements of the schoolhouse architecture of its time. The rooms were large and airy, with tall shuttered windows. Not far from the school lay a compound cut off from public view by a screen of trees. The house that occupied the center of this compound was much smaller and less visible than the school, yet its appearance was, if anything, even more arresting. Built entirely of wood, it stood on a 2-meter tall trestle of stilts, as if to suggest it belonged more in the Himalayas than in the tide country. The roof was a steeply pitched wooden pyramid sitting upon a grid of symmetrical lines, stilts and columns, windows and balustrades. Rows of French windows were set into the walls, and their floor-to-ceiling shutters opened into a shaded veranda that ran all the way around the house. In front there was a lily-covered pond, skirted by a pathway of mossy bricks. In 1970, Kanai recalled this compound had seemed lonely and secluded. Although it was situated in the center of the settlement, there were few other dwellings nearby. It was as though some lingering attitude of deference or respect had prompted the islanders to keep their distance from that wooden house. But that had changed now. It was clear at a glance that the area was among the most heavily trafficked in the whole island. Clusters of huts, houses, stalls, sweet shops, and the like had grown up around the compound. The lanes that snaked around its perimeter echoed to the sound of filmy music, and the air was heavy with the smell of freshly fried jalebis. Kanai glanced over his shoulder and saw that Nilima was busy discussing trust business with a couple of office holders of the women's union. Slipping away, he pushed open the compound's gate and went hurrying up the mossy pathway that led up to the house. To his surprise, none of the noise and bustle of the village seemed to filter into the compound, and for a moment he felt as though he were stepping through a warp in time. The house seemed at once very old and very new. The wood, discolored by the sun and rain, had acquired a silvery patina, like certain kinds of bark. It reflected the light in such a way as to appear almost translucent, like a skin of mirrored metal. It seemed now to be almost blue in color, reflecting the tint of the sky. On reaching the stilts, Kanai stopped to peer at the dappled underside of the house. The geometric pattern of shadows was exactly as he remembered. He went up the steps and was starting towards the front door when he heard his uncle's voice echoing back from the past. "You can't go in that way," Nirmal was saying. "Don't you remember? The key to the front door was lost years ago. We'll have to go all the way around." Retracing the steps of that earlier visit, Kanai went down the veranda around the corner of the balcony, and along the next wing until he came to a small door at the rear of the house. The door opened at a touch, and on stepping in, the first object to meet his eyes was an old-fashioned porcelain toilet with a wooden seat. Next to it was an enormous cast-iron bathtub with clawed feet and a curling rim. A shower head curled over it like a flower drooping on a wilted stem. The fittings seemed somewhat more rusty since he had first seen them, but they were otherwise unchanged. Kenai remembered how eagerly, as a boy, he'd taken them in. Since coming to Lusibari, he'd had to bathe in a pond, just as Nirmal and Nilima did. He'd longed to step under that shower. "This is a Shahabi Chubacha, a white man's tank," Nirmal had said, pointing to the bathtub. "Shahabs used them to bathe in." Kenai remembered that he had been struck by the aptness of the description, while also being offended at being spoken to as if he were a yokel who'd never seen such things. "I know what that is," he had said. "It's a bathtub." A door led out from the bathroom into the interior of the house. Pushing it open, Kenai found himself in a cavernous wood-paneled room. Clouds of dust hung as if frozen in the angled shafts of light admitted by the louvered shutters. A huge iron bedstead stood marooned in the middle of the floor, like the remains of a drowned atoll. On the walls, there were fading portraits in heavy frames. The pictures were of mem sahibs in long dresses and men in knee-length breeches. Kenai came to a stop in front of a portrait of a young woman in a lacy dress, sitting on a grassy moor dotted with yellow wildflowers. In the background were steep slopes covered with purple gorse and mountains flecked with snow. A grimy copper plate beneath the picture said, "Lucy Mackay Hamilton, Isle of Arran." Who was she? Kenai could hear his voice echoing back from the past. Who was this Lucy Hamilton? "She's the woman from whom this island takes its name." Did she live here? In this house? No, she was on her way here from the far end of Europe when her ship capsized. She never got to see the house, but because it had been built for her, people used to call it Lusibari. Then this was shortened to Lusibari, and that was how the island took this name. But even though this house was the original Lusibari, people stopped calling it that. Now everyone speaks of it as the Hamilton House. Why? Because it was built by Sir Daniel McKennan Hamilton, Lucy's uncle. Haven't you seen his name on the school? And who was he? You really want to know? Yes. All right, then listen. The knob-knuckled finger rose to point to the heavens. Now that you've asked, you'll have to listen and pay attention. For all of this is true.